The lecture hall of the Galactic Medical Institute stood as a monument to civilization's triumph over mortality. Its walls, constructed from translucent crystalline compounds mined from the core of dead stars, refracted light in ways that soothed even the most anxious of species. Here, the galaxy's brightest minds gathered to learn the delicate art of preserving life, of maintaining the fragile balance between existence and oblivion. For 300 cycles, no student had died within these hallowed chambers. For 300 cycles, the protocols had held firm, the procedures had remained unchallenged, and the methodology had stood as an unshakable pillar of certainty. That record, Professor Zeleth often reminded her students, was the institution's greatest pride. She would say this with her 4 ocular organs gleaming with satisfaction, her chitinous plates clicking in approval. But on this particular rotation, as the morning light cascaded through those ancient walls, none of them understood that certainty was about to shatter like glass beneath a hammer's fall. Kira Okonkwo sat in the back row, her human frame slouched in a chair designed for beings with entirely different anatomical considerations. She had learned to ignore the discomfort during her first week, just as she had learned to ignore the stares, the whispers, the way conversations died when she entered common areas. Earth had been granted membership in the Galactic Coalition only 2 standard years prior, and humans remained a curiosity, a controversy, a source of endless academic debate. Were they truly sentient in the way the established species understood sentience? Could a race that evolved on a death world, that survived through violence and adaptation rather than cooperation and logic, truly integrate into civilized society? The questions followed Kira like shadows, unspoken but omnipresent. She had stopped trying to answer them. Instead, she focused on her studies, on proving through action what words could never convey. Her grades ranked in the top percentile. Her practical examinations exceeded expectations. Yet still, she remained apart, separated by an invisible barrier constructed from fear and misunderstanding. The other students filtered into the amphitheater, a kaleidoscope of forms and functions that represented 73 distinct species from across 4 spiral arms. There was Velmore, whose gaseous form required a containment suit that hummed with electromagnetic fields. There was Thrisic, whose crystalline structure refracted thought itself, allowing her to process medical scenarios in 11 dimensions simultaneously. There was Paktar, whose 3-meter frame and gentle nature made him the most popular student in their cohort, despite his species' reputation as philosophers rather than physicians. They nodded to one another, shared data streams, and synchronized their learning modules with practiced ease. Kira received polite acknowledgement, nothing more. She had long since accepted this as the price of being first, of being the human who dared to walk among the stars before her species had earned the right. Professor Zeleth entered with characteristic precision, her movements calculated to conserve energy, every gesture economical and purposeful. The Kithrak species had evolved in an environment of scarcity, where wastefulness meant extinction, and that evolutionary heritage remained encoded in their very beings. She carried no datapad, no physical materials. Information existed as pure thought, transmitted through quantum-entangled nodes that connected directly to the neural substrates of every species present. All except humans. Kira still relied on her handheld device, her primitive biological computer struggling to keep pace with beings who had transcended such limitations millennia ago. Today, the professor began, her vocal synthesizer translating her chemical-based language into something approximating standard galactic. We will examine emergency response protocols for catastrophic injury. The scenarios we will explore exist at the boundaries of medical intervention, where the difference between life and death measures in fractions of a cycle. I have invited a special demonstration team to illustrate proper technique. She paused, her antennae twitching with what might have been satisfaction. You will observe, you will learn, and you will understand why our methods have preserved countless billions across the ages. The demonstration began with clinical detachment. A simulated patient, constructed from biological analogs and sophisticated machinery, lay upon the examination platform. The scenario: massive trauma to the primary circulatory system, multiple fractures, neural damage consistent with high-velocity impact. The kind of injury that occurred in industrial accidents, in rare cases of malfunction aboard transit vessels, in the unfortunate moments when technology failed and flesh paid the price. The demonstration team moved with rehearsed grace, their actions flowing like water, smooth and uninterrupted. They established communication. They assessed the damage using non-invasive scanners. They consulted the medical database, cross-referencing symptoms with established protocols. They administered careful doses of cellular regeneration compounds. They stabilized the patient using force field technology that prevented further deterioration. Every step followed procedure. Every action aligned with doctrine. The patient's vital signs steadied, hovering in the yellow zone between critical and stable, maintained by technology and patience. "Observe the precision," Professor Zeloth narrated, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Observe the careful calibration of intervention. We do not rush. We do not panic. We allow the protocols to guide us toward optimal outcomes. This is civilization. This is progress. This is how we have conquered death itself, not through barbaric urgency, but through systematic excellence." The students absorbed this lesson, their various forms of cognition processing, and filing the information according to their species' particular neurological architecture. All except Kira, who sat very still, her jaw clenched, her hands gripping the edge of her seat with a force that turned her knuckles white. She said nothing. Not yet. But something in her expression, some quality that the other students could not quite identify, suggested that a storm was building behind those Deathworlder eyes, and when it broke, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The alarm's piercing wail shattered the carefully constructed atmosphere of academic discourse like a stone through ice. It was not the gentle chime that signaled the end of a lecture period, nor the melodic tone that indicated a scheduled drill. This was the sound reserved for genuine emergencies, for the moments when theory collided with brutal reality and found itself wanting. Professor Zeloth's antennae snapped to attention, her entire body going rigid in a display of instinctual alarm that transcended species barriers. The demonstration team froze mid-motion, their carefully rehearsed movements interrupted by the raw intrusion of chaos. The students looked to one another, confusion rippling through the amphitheater in waves that Kira could almost see, could almost touch. They had trained for this moment in simulations, in carefully controlled environments where every variable had been accounted for, every outcome predetermined. But this was different. This was real. The secondary doors burst open, and medical staff flooded through carrying what could only be described as carnage made flesh. The being on the stretcher was Tolvan, a third-year student that Kira recognized from advanced surgery seminars. His species, the Valkyrie, possessed exoskeletons tougher than most alloys, internal redundancies that could sustain life even after catastrophic organ failure, and a reputation for being nearly indestructible. Nearly. The laboratory accident that had torn through his body had proven that even the most resilient biology had limits when confronted with sufficient force. One of his primary locomotion appendages had been severed cleanly, the stump still smoking from whatever had caused the trauma. His thorax had been crushed inward, the chitinous plates cracked, and bleeding luminescent fluid that pooled beneath him in spreading puddles. Worst of all, his breathing orifices, all 7 of them, were producing sounds that transcended language, that communicated suffering in its purest, most universal form. The medical team transferred him to the central platform, replacing the simulation dummy with flesh and agony. Professor Zeleth moved immediately into command mode, her training overriding the visible shock that had momentarily paralyzed her. She began issuing orders in rapid succession, her chemical translated instantaneously by the room's systems. Scanners were deployed. Databases were consulted. The proper specialists were summoned via quantum entangled communication. The protocols were initiated, each step following the established guidelines that had served the galaxy for countless generations. And Tolvan continued to die. Not quickly, not mercifully, but with the slow inevitability of a sun burning through its final reserves of hydrogen. His vital signs, displayed on holographic projections that surrounded the platform like accusing angels, showed a cascade of failures rippling through his systems. The yellow zone gave way to orange, then to red, and still the proper responses were being calibrated, still the appropriate interventions were being calculated. Kira was on her feet before conscious thought could catch up to instinct. Her body moved with a purpose that bypassed the higher functions of her brain, driven by something older, something forged in the crucible of a world where hesitation meant extinction. She vaulted over the row of seats in front of her, her movements graceless but effective, drawing startled reactions from students who had never seen a human move with genuine urgency. She hit the floor of the amphitheater at a run, her legs pumping with the kind of desperate speed that evolution had granted to prey animals and predators alike. The distance to the central platform seemed to stretch before her, time dilating in that peculiar way it did when adrenaline flooded the system, when every heartbeat became a countdown to catastrophe. "Stop!" The word erupted from her throat with sufficient force to cut through the organized chaos, to momentarily halt the carefully choreographed dance of proper medical procedure. Heads turned. Eyes, compound and simple, single and multiple, focused on the human who had dared to interrupt. Professor Zeleth's antennae quivered with something that might have been anger or might have been disbelief. "Student Okonkwo, return to your seat immediately. You are disrupting critical medical procedures. The protocols must be followed. We cannot allow emotion to compromise systematic care." But Kira was no longer listening. She had reached the platform, her hands already moving with trained precision, assessing the damage with eyes that had been shaped by a different kind of evolution, a different philosophy of survival. She saw what the scanners couldn't quantify, what the databases couldn't predict. She saw a living being bleeding out while civilization debated the proper response. "He's going into shock," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had seen death too many times to mistake its approach. "His circulatory system is collapsing. In 90 seconds, maybe less, his brain will be starved of oxygen. Your regeneration compounds won't matter if there's no functioning neural tissue to regenerate." She looked at Professor Zeleth, and in that moment, the barriers of species and culture fell away, leaving only physician speaking to physician. "Let me help him. Please." The professor's response came after a pause that felt like an eternity compressed into heartbeats. Her voice carried layers of meaning that the translator struggled to convey. Doubt, curiosity, fear. "You would violate established protocols? You would risk censure, expulsion, the ending of your academic career?" Kira's response was to strip off her jacket and roll up her sleeves, revealing the corded muscle and scarred tissue of a Deathworlder's arms, arms that had been built by gravity 1.5 times Earth standard, by an atmosphere that was slightly toxic to most species, by a sun that burned with savage intensity. "I would save his life. Watch and learn." She turned to Tolvan's broken body, her mind already cataloging, prioritizing, executing the brutal calculus of emergency medicine as practiced on a world where gentleness was a luxury and speed was survival. She pressed her hands directly against the severed limb, applying pressure with a force that made several students gasp in horror. No scanner mediated her touch. No force field protected her from direct contact with alien biology. She was flesh against flesh, human against Valkyrie, and her voice when she spoke again carried the weight of absolute authority. "Someone give me something I can use as a tourniquet. Now! Don't think. Don't consult. Move!" Velmore was the first to respond, perhaps because his species' gaseous nature made them naturally adaptable, or perhaps because something in Kira's tone transcended the usual hierarchies of galactic civilization. He yanked a length of flexible tubing from a nearby medical cart, the kind used for gentle drainage procedures, and thrust it toward the human's outstretched hand. She caught it without looking, her eyes never leaving Tolvan's failing body, and with movements that seemed almost violent in their directness, she wrapped it around the stump of his severed appendage. The tourniquet tightened with a force that made the watching students recoil, but the flow of luminescent blood slowed, then stopped. Basic. Primitive. Effective. "His thorax," Kira continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a combat medic calling out triage priorities under fire. "The collapsed sections are putting pressure on his primary oxygen exchange organs. If we don't relieve that pressure, he'll asphyxiate even if we stop the bleeding." Her hands moved to his chest, feeling along the fractured chitin with a delicacy that seemed to contradict her previous urgency. She was reading his body like text, interpreting the language of trauma that was written across his flesh in characters of pain and damage. Professor Zeleth watched with an expression that might have been horror or might have been fascination, her translator struggling to keep pace with the storm of chemical signals her body was producing. "The proper procedure requires a full structural scan before any manipulative intervention. The database must be consulted to determine the optimal approach for Valkyrie physiology. To proceed without this information risks causing additional trauma, risks violating the fundamental principle of first, do no harm." The words came automatically, recited like prayer, like scripture, like the immutable laws that govern civilization itself. But they rang hollow in the face of Tolvan's deteriorating vital signs, in the face of the orange zones bleeding into red across every holographic display. Kira looked up, and her eyes, those strange Deathworlder eyes that held colors most species couldn't even perceive, burned with something that might have been anger or might have been pity. "First, do no harm is a principle for chronic care, for managed conditions, for situations where you have the luxury of time. This isn't that. This is combat medicine. This is battlefield triage. This is the reality that my species has lived with for 200,000 years of evolution on a planet that spent every single day trying to kill us." She turned back to Tolvan, her hands finding the precise point where his fractured thorax needed release. "On Earth, we have a different principle. First, keep them alive. Everything else is negotiable." Her thumbs pressed inward, finding the stress points in the damaged chitin, and with a sudden, controlled application of force, she created a release point. The collapsed section shifted, and Tolvan's breathing orifices produced a sound that was somehow less agonized, somehow more like life than approaching death. Thrisic, the crystalline student who processed reality in 11 dimensions, spoke for the first time, her voice like wine through broken glass. "The human is performing emergency thoracotomy without imaging guidance. This violates 17 distinct protocols. The probability of causing irreparable harm exceeds 47% by standard calculations. Yet the patient's oxygen saturation is improving. The contradiction is unsettling." She paused, her internal structure refracting light in patterns that suggested deep contemplation. How is this possible? How can ignorance of proper procedure produce superior outcomes? Paktar, The gentle giant whose species had transcended physical violence 30,000 years ago moved closer to the platform. His 3-meter frame bent low as he studied Kira's movements with an intensity that suggested his philosophical mind had found a puzzle worth solving. "She is not ignorant," he said slowly, his deep voice carrying harmonics that spoke of ancient wisdom. "She knows, but her knowledge comes from a different source. Watch her hands. Every movement serves multiple purposes. She is feeling temperature gradients to assess inflammation. She is reading pulse through direct contact. She is using her own body as a diagnostic instrument because her species evolved without the technology to mediate their relationship with injury and death." Kira's hands continued their work, moving with a sureness that came from something deeper than training, something encoded at a level where conscious thought gave way to survival instinct refined across epochs. She elevated Tolvan's remaining limbs, and probing blood flowed to his core. She cleared his breathing orifices with her fingers, no barrier between her flesh and his, no concern for the contamination protocols that governed every interaction in galactic medicine. She spoke to him in his own language, which she had learned phonetically without truly understanding, her voice low and steady, providing the psychological anchor that every trauma victim needed even when their body was failing. And slowly, incrementally, measurably, Tolvan stabilized. Not in the yellow zone. Not hovering at the edge of crisis. But truly, genuinely stable. The silence that fell over the amphitheater carried weight, carried meaning, carried the sound of worldviews cracking under pressure they were never designed to withstand. Professor Zeleth approached the platform, her movements careful, her antennae swept back in a posture that indicated deep uncertainty. She studied the human's work, the crude tourniquet, the manually relieved thoracic pressure, the utterly barbaric directness of every intervention. She looked at the vital signs, now solidly in the yellow zone and trending toward green. She looked at Tolvan, whose breathing had steadied, whose agony had diminished to mere pain, who would live to see another sunrise. "You saved him," she said finally, and her voice carried tones that the translator rendered as confusion, wonder, and something that might have been shame. "You violated every protocol we teach. You ignored centuries of accumulated medical knowledge. You used techniques that are classified as primitive in our databases. And you saved him." She turned to face the assembled students, her body language shifting into something that might have been defeat or might have been the beginning of understanding. "Perhaps," she said slowly, each word chosen with obvious care, "we have been asking the wrong questions about humanity." The Galactic Medical Institute's Board of Inquiry convened 3 cycles after the incident, their chamber a stark contrast to the welcoming aesthetics of the lecture halls. Here, functionality trumped comfort, and the atmosphere carried the weight of judgment rendered across millennia of precedent. Kira stood at the center of a circular space, surrounded by holographic representations of the board members, 17 beings representing the most advanced medical civilizations in known space. Their forms varied wildly, from the pure energy consciousness of the Strath to the hive-mind colony intelligence of the Prexal, but their purpose was unified. They were here to determine whether Kira Okonkwo had saved a life or merely delayed a death that proper procedure could have prevented more elegantly. The distinction mattered. It mattered to her future. It mattered to humanity's place in the coalition. It mattered to every species that would come after, looking to the stars and wondering if civilization had room for those who had learned survival in crucibles of fire rather than gardens of careful cultivation. Director M.M. Shaw, whose species had developed regenerative medicine 3,000 years before humans discovered agriculture, spoke first. His form, a collection of bioluminescent tendrils arranged in patterns of subtle beauty, pulsed with colors that the translator rendered as stern formality. "Student Okonkwo, You stand accused of gross violation of medical protocols during an emergency response scenario. 17 distinct breaches have been documented. Your actions place the patient at significant risk of additional trauma, contamination, and long-term complications. The fact that the patient survived does not absolve you of reckless endangerment. Indeed, the board must consider whether your actions set a dangerous precedent that could lead to countless future deaths as students mistake urgency for wisdom. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Before we deliberate on appropriate sanctions, including possible expulsion and revocation of your medical credentials, you are granted an opportunity to explain your actions. Speak now, and speak truthfully. Kira met his gaze, or what approximated as gaze for a being with no discreet eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the deference that was expected in such circumstances. This was not defiance born of arrogance, but rather the simple honesty of someone who had walked through fire and emerged holding exactly what they intended to carry. I acted to preserve life using the most effective means available in a time-critical situation. Every technique I employed has been tested across millions of emergency scenarios on Earth. The tourniquet has saved countless soldiers, accident victims, and disaster survivors. Manual thoracic decompression has a success rate exceeding 90% when performed by trained personnel under field conditions. Direct patient contact provides sensory information that scanners cannot duplicate, particularly when dealing with unknown physiology. She paused, gathering her thoughts like weapons. But more importantly, I recognized something that your protocols did not account for. Time was the enemy. Every second spent consulting databases, every moment devoted to establishing optimal parameters, was a second in which Tolvan moved closer to irreversible neural death. Your methods are designed for environments where technology is reliable, where backup systems exist, where the patient can afford to wait. They are beautiful methods, elegant methods, but they are not universal methods. Counselor Thresic, the crystalline being who had witnessed the event firsthand, manifested her holographic presence with unusual intensity. Her voice carried harmonics that suggested she had spent considerable time processing the experience across her 11-dimensional consciousness. The human raises a point that disturbs my calculations. Our protocols assume the presence of advanced medical technology. We have designed our emergency responses around the availability of regeneration fields, cellular reconstruction, quantum healing matrices. But what occurs when these systems fail? What occurs in remote locations, in disaster scenarios, in the chaos of war? Her structure refracted light in patterns of deep concern. I have reviewed Earth's medical history. Their species has developed extensive knowledge of trauma care precisely because they cannot assume technological support. They have refined techniques for the worst possible circumstances. Perhaps what we witnessed was not a violation of proper medicine, but rather a demonstration of a parallel medical tradition that we have never needed to develop. The testimony continued for hours, cycles of interrogation and explanation that circled around a fundamental question that nobody seemed willing to articulate directly. Could violence be medicine? Could directness be compassion? Could the brutal pragmatism of a death world produce healing that civilization's gentle touch could not achieve? Witness after witness appeared before the board, their testimony painting a complex picture. The demonstration team admitted that their protocols would have required 43 additional seconds before achieving the stabilization that Kira had accomplished in less than 10. Professor Zelith, her antennae drooping in what might have been exhaustion or might have been the weight of reconsidered certainty, testified that Tolvan's neural scans showed no lasting damage, no complications beyond those expected from the initial trauma. Most powerful of all was Tolvan himself, still recovering but insistent on addressing the board directly. His synthesized voice, translated from the clicks and whistles of Valkyrie communication, carried an emotional weight that transcended species barriers. The human did not save my life gently. She did not preserve me with the elegance I had been taught to expect from proper medical care. But she saved me absolutely, completely, with a certainty that came from some place deeper than protocol. When I was dying, when my consciousness was fading, I felt her hands on my body, and they were not gentle hands, but they were sure hands, and they told me something that all your scanners and databases could not communicate. They told me that I would not be allowed to die. Not today. Not while a Deathworlder stood watch. Director M.M. Shaw absorbed all of this information, his bioluminescent form pulsing with patterns that suggested intense deliberation. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried tones that the translator struggled to render properly, settling for approximations like reluctant respect and uncomfortable enlightenment. This board has reached a preliminary conclusion. Student Okonkwo will not face expulsion or sanctions. However, neither can we unreservedly endorse her methods without further study. Instead, we propose a new path forward. He turned the full force of his attention toward Kira, and even through holographic projection, she felt the weight of it. You will develop a comprehensive curriculum on emergency trauma response from a human perspective. You will teach us your Deathworld medicine, not to replace our protocols, but to supplement them, to provide options for situations where elegance must yield to urgency. And in doing so, you will help us answer the question that your actions have forced us to confront. What is civilization? Is it the rejection of our violent origins? Or is it the wisdom to know when survival demands that we remember them? 6 months had passed since the Board of Inquiry, and the lecture hall of the Galactic Medical Institute had been transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The crystalline walls remained unchanged, still refracting light in patterns of calculated beauty, but new equipment lined the sides of the amphitheater. Medical bags constructed from durable synthetic materials, filled with supplies that seemed almost primitive compared to the usual technological sophistication on display. Tourniquets of various designs, each adapted for different physiologies. Pressure bandages, manual defibrillation units, chest seals, airway management tools that required no power source, no computer guidance, nothing but trained hands and determined will. These were the instruments of field medicine, of combat care, of the brutal art that humanity had perfected across countless battlefields and disaster zones. And now, for the first time in the Institute's 300-cycle history, they were being taught to students who came from worlds where violence was historical curiosity rather than lived experience. Kira stood at the front of the amphitheater, no longer relegated to the back row, no longer separated by invisible barriers of fear and misunderstanding. She wore the instructor's sash, a mark of authority that still felt strange against her chest, still felt like something borrowed rather than earned. But when she looked out at the assembled students, 73 species representing the breadth of galactic civilization, she saw something that had not existed before. She saw attention. She saw respect. She saw curiosity that transcended the usual academic interest and approached something more fundamental, more urgent. They were here not because they had to be, but because the universe had revealed itself to be less predictable than their protocols assumed, and they wanted to be prepared when certainty failed. Welcome to Emergency Trauma Response, Human Protocols. Kira began, her voice carrying across the amphitheater without amplification, a skill she had learned from drill instructors who commanded attention through presence rather than technology. Before we begin, I need you to understand something fundamental about the material we'll be covering. This is not elegant medicine. This is not the careful, systematic approach you've been trained in. This is battlefield medicine, disaster medicine, the medicine of last resort when everything else has failed. It is messy. It is direct. It often involves causing controlled harm to prevent greater harm. And it requires you to make peace with a reality that many of your species have successfully left behind. She paused, letting her words settle. It requires you to accept that sometimes survival is more important than comfort. Sometimes life is more important than dignity. Sometimes you have to break someone in order to save them. Thrisic, who had become something approaching a friend in the months since the incident, raised one of her crystalline appendages in the gesture that indicated a question. Her voice carried harmonics of genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Instructor Okonkwo, how do you reconcile this philosophy with the fundamental medical principle of preserving patient autonomy? On most civilized worlds, we ask permission before we act. We consult with the patient regarding treatment options. We respect their right to refuse intervention. But in the scenarios you describe, these considerations seem absent. How do you navigate the ethical implications? Kira nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. It was the kind of inquiry that cut to the heart of the difference between Deathworld medicine and the galactic standard. On Earth, we have a principle called implied consent. When someone is dying, when they cannot communicate their wishes, we assume that they want to live unless we have explicit evidence otherwise. It's not perfect. It leads to ethical gray zones. But it emerged from hard experience, from thousands of years of watching people die while we debated the proper response. She moved to the demonstration platform, where a sophisticated training dummy had been configured to simulate a dozen different physiologies. Let me be clear. I am not suggesting that galactic medicine abandon its ethical frameworks. But I am suggesting that those frameworks were developed in contexts of relative safety, and they may need adaptation for situations where safety is not guaranteed. The semester unfolded like a revelation, like a door opening onto rooms that had always existed but had never been explored. The students learned to assess trauma using only their senses, whatever senses their species possessed. They learned to stop bleeding with pressure and elevation and, when necessary, chemical coagulants that worked across a broad spectrum of biochemistries. They learned to clear airways, to manage shock, to stabilize fractures using whatever materials were available. Most importantly, they learned to think in triage categories, to make the hard calculations about who could be saved and who was beyond help, to allocate limited resources toward maximum survival. These were lessons that made some students uncomfortable, that violated deeply held beliefs about the value of every individual life. But they were also